The girl boss era is dead, and the women who built their entire lives around it are now screaming from the rooftops for younger women to run the other way. By 2030, nearly half of women aged 25 to 44 in the United States will be single and childless, not because they failed at everything, but because they followed the exact blueprint handed to them by decades of messages promising empowerment through endless careers, independence at all costs, and the idea that family and partnership were optional extras rather than core parts of a fulfilling existence. These women poured their prime years into climbing ladders that led nowhere sustainable, traded potential families for promotions and degrees, and now face a reality where the promises of fulfillment have evaporated into regret, isolation, and financial strain that no corporate title can fix. Stick around until the end, because what comes next is the part no one saw coming. The men these women once dismissed are not rushing back to save the day. They have built lives of genuine peace and freedom. And the reversal of roles is permanent. Listen carefully, because this is not about blame or finger pointing. It is about facing the plain facts of how choices compound over time. And what happens when entire generations buy into a narrative that sounded liberating but delivered the opposite? For years, the dominant cultural voice told women that true success meant prioritizing education and career above all else, that marriage and children could wait until the resume was perfect, that depending on a man for anything was weakness, and that the state, the job market, or personal grit would always provide the security once reserved for committed partnerships. Women heard this message loud and clear from media, education, friends, and even some family members. So they leaned in hard, delayed relationships, focused on climbing corporate structures, accumulated credentials, and built identities around being self made powerhouses. In their 20s, it felt exhilarating. The validation from achievements, the freedom of controlling their own schedules and finances, the sense of breaking barriers that previous generations could only dream about. But biology and human nature do not bend to cultural trends, no matter how forcefully they are pushed. Fertility windows narrow. Energy for building deep connections fades under constant professional pressure, and the dopamine hits from promotions start to feel hollow when there is no one to share real life victories or challenges with at the end of the day. Now, those same women, many in their 30s and 40s, are speaking out with a raw honesty that cuts through the old slogans. They describe waking up to the realization that the corner office or the impressive title did not fill the void left by absent family life. One woman who chased high level tech roles at major companies explained how the grind destroyed her health, triggered chronic conditions from stress and neglect, and left her questioning everything once she stepped back into a more balanced arrangement supported by a partner who actually provided care and stability. She warned directly that the girl boss path is not worth the trade offs, that the sanity and physical well being she lost took years to even partially recover, and that the freedom she thought she was gaining was actually a trap disguised as empowerment. Others echo this, admitting they fell for the idea that hyperindependence was strength, that they could handle everything alone, only to reach their 30s still without children or a stable family unit, reevaluating their values and realizing that what they truly wanted was connection and legacy through loved ones, not just another line on a resume. The stories pile up. Women who once celebrated their solo achievements now openly grieve the absence of kids running around, a husband to lean on during tough times, or even the simple daily support that comes from a committed household. This shift is not isolated or anecdotal. The data backs it up in stark terms. Surveys tracking women's happiness since the rise of modern feminism show consistent declines across every measurable category: higher rates of mental health struggles, substance issues, profound loneliness, and of course, the collapsing birth rates that signal entire populations choosing not to reproduce. Marriage rates have plummeted. Divorce remains common even when it happens later. And the traditional model of a single earner supporting a family has become nearly impossible in many places due to economic pressures that force dual incomes or leave single parents scraping by. What was sold as liberation turned into a double burden for many women, expected to perform at elite levels in the workplace while still carrying the majority of domestic responsibilities, even in partnerships. Studies confirm that in heterosexual couples where both work, women often handle upwards of 80% of the home labor, leaving them exhausted and resentful. The promise that feminism would equalize everything ignored the reality that human energy is finite and that trying to be everything to everyone often means excelling at nothing while burning out completely. Meanwhile, the men who were told to step aside, to not approach, to accept rejection as normal, and to never question the new rules have listened. They have not vanished into bitterness. They have adapted by redefining what a good life looks like on their own terms. Millions have stepped away from traditional 9 to 5 structures, not out of laziness, but out of a calculated choice to preserve their mental health, finances, and autonomy. They pursue gig work, build online ventures, live off savings strategically, or qualify for support systems when needed, all while keeping expenses low and prioritizing rest, hobbies, travel, and personal growth over the old script of endless grinding to provide for a family that may never materialize or appreciate the effort. This is not retreat. It is redirection toward paths that offer control and peace instead of constant performance for diminishing returns. The workplaces that once demanded loyalty now face automation and artificial intelligence taking over roles that were disproportionately held by women in administrative, clerical, and service sectors, accelerating the very economic uncertainty that hits hardest those who bet everything on career stability without a backup of family support. Women who once declared they needed no man are now confronting the hard limits of going it alone in a world where inflation erodes savings, housing costs soar beyond single incomes in many cities, and social safety nets strain under demographic pressures. The state that was supposed to replace traditional provision has its own limits, budgets tighten, benefits get cut or become harder to access, and the illusion of endless security crumbles. Loneliness compounds the problem. Without a partner or children, the daily human contact that buffers against despair disappears, leaving many to face aging and potential health issues without the natural support network that families provide. The regret is palpable in the warnings they issue to younger women. Do not repeat our mistakes. Do not sacrifice your fertility window for another degree or promotion. Do not believe that you can delay family indefinitely and still have it waiting when you are ready. They speak from experience, knowing that the cultural narrative downplayed the costs until they became irreversible for many. Yet the most striking part is the asymmetry in how men and women are responding to this reality. Men are not panicking or begging for reconciliation. They are quietly thriving in simplicity, finding that life without the drama, expectations, and potential liabilities of modern relationships allows for more genuine contentment. They keep their earnings for themselves, avoid the financial risks of marriage in an era of no fault divorce, and discover that solitude with purpose beats forced companionship filled with resentment. Women, on the other hand, are increasingly vocal about wanting partnership again, about desiring providers, protectors, and companions. But the men who once lined up for those roles have moved on. They have internalized the message that their presence was optional at best and burdensome at worst. So they have chosen to opt out entirely rather than return to dynamics that feel one sided. This is not revenge, It is logic, self preservation, and the natural outcome of being told repeatedly that independence was the goal and that men were holding women back. The divide widens every year as younger women hear these warnings, but still face immense pressure to follow the same path that led to regret in the first place. The culture continues to celebrate solo success stories while quietly ignoring the growing cohort of women who discover too late that achievement alone does not create lasting meaning. Connection does, family does, shared purpose does, but those require trade offs that the girl boss narrative refused to acknowledge. Men have learned to live without those elements if necessary, building lives that prioritize their own well being above societal expectations, while women who bet against biology and human interdependence now pay the price in ways that no amount of professional success can offset. The consequences of this massive cultural experiment are now visible in every major city and small town across the Western world, where the architecture of daily life has quietly shifted to accommodate a growing population of people living entirely solo. Apartment buildings advertise one bedroom units as luxury rather than necessity. Meal delivery services thrive on single portion packaging. Streaming platforms design algorithms that reward solitary binge watching, and social media feeds overflow with content celebrating the freedom of having no one to answer to. What once looked like progress toward individual liberation has morphed into a landscape of enforced isolation for millions, particularly women who bought into the vision hardest and longest. The statistics paint a sobering picture of what happens when an entire demographic postpones or abandons the formation of stable family units in favor of perpetual self optimization. Birth rates in developed nations have fallen below replacement levels for decades, with some countries now hovering around 1.3 or 1.4 children per woman, numbers that guarantee shrinking populations, strained pension systems, and elder care crises that no government program can fully resolve. In the United States alone, the percentage of women reaching age 40 without ever having given birth has climbed steadily, crossing 30% in many urban centers and showing no signs of reversal despite endless articles urging people to have kids before it is too late. This demographic reality creates ripple effects that touch every layer of society, from housing markets strained by demand for smaller, more expensive units to workplaces facing chronic talent shortages as fewer young people enter the labor pool. Schools consolidate or close in regions where classrooms once overflowed. Hospitals prepare for waves of aging residents who lack adult children to assist with daily needs, and entire industries built around family oriented consumption, from minivans to family vacation packages, quietly contract. The women at the center of the shift often discover these broader implications only after the personal toll becomes undeniable. They speak of nights spent scrolling through photos of friends' children and grandchildren, feeling a pang that no amount of career accolades can soothe. They describe the awkwardness of holiday gatherings where conversations revolve around school events, soccer practices, and family milestones while they contribute stories about work projects or solo travel that suddenly feel thin by comparison. The absence grows heavier with each passing year, not because they regret ambition itself, but because they were assured that ambition and family could coexist without serious compromise, only to learn through hard experience that time and energy are zero sum resources. And what makes the current moment particularly stark is the way former advocates of the girl boss philosophy have begun to pivot in public. Influencers, authors, and high profile professionals who once wrote best selling books about leaning in, breaking glass ceilings, and rejecting traditional roles now publish essays and appear on podcasts retracting or heavily qualifying those earlier positions. They admit that the narrative they helped spread downplayed biological realities, overstated the replaceability of human relationships with professional networks, and underestimated the cumulative emotional cost of chronic solitude. One prominent voice in the corporate world described how she spent her 30s and early 40s convinced that marriage and motherhood would derail her trajectory, only to reach her late 40s facing health scares, financial pressures from rising living costs, and a profound sense of disconnection that therapy and achievement could not resolve. She now cautions younger women that the independence she once championed came at the expense of interdependence, the kind of mutual reliance that makes life feel secure and meaningful rather than merely survivable. These public reckonings carry weight because they come from people who lived the experiment at its most intense levels, people who had the resources, the networks, and the discipline to push furthest along the path, yet still arrived at the same destination of dissatisfaction. The economic dimension deserves close attention because it reveals how thoroughly the model depended on assumptions that no longer hold. When women entered the workforce en masse and dual income households became the norm, housing prices, education costs, and everyday expenses adjusted upward to absorb the extra earnings. What was once affordable on a single professional salary now requires two, often more, especially in high cost areas. Women who remained single or divorced found themselves competing in that same inflated market without the second income or the shared responsibilities that ease the burden. Inflation compounds the pressure, eroding purchasing power faster than wages rise in many sectors, particularly those dominated by women such as education, healthcare support roles, and administrative positions. Meanwhile, automation and artificial intelligence continue to displace routine cognitive and clerical work at accelerating rates, eliminating jobs that provided stable middle class livelihoods for decades. The result is a growing cohort of women in their 30s and 40s who face downward mobility not because they lack talent or effort, but because the ladder they climbed rested on economic conditions that have since eroded. Men have responded to these same pressures in markedly different ways, choosing adaptation over continued participation in a system that offers declining returns. Rather than fighting to maintain traditional provider roles in an environment where provision no longer guarantees appreciation or stability, many have downsized their ambitions in the paid workforce and upsized their control over personal time and resources. They relocate to lower cost regions, embrace remote or freelance arrangements, build side ventures that generate passive income, or simply maintain lean lifestyles that allow them to work 20 or 30 hours a week instead of 60. The freedom this creates is tangible. Mornings without alarms, afternoons for hobbies or exercise, evenings free from domestic negotiations or financial stress tied to supporting dependents. They report higher subjective well being in surveys tracking life satisfaction among never married or childless men compared to their counterparts from previous generations who followed the conventional script. The data suggests that when men remove the expectation of lifelong provision for a family, they redirect energy towards self mastery, friendships, creative pursuits, and travel, often finding a level of contentment that eluded earlier cohorts trapped in unfulfilling marriages or exhausting breadwinner roles. This divergence in outcomes highlights a fundamental mismatch between cultural messaging and human incentives. Women were encouraged to seek maximum independence, while men were simultaneously told their traditional contributions were obsolete or oppressive. Both messages were internalized, but the results diverged because the underlying biology and psychology did not change. Women remain wired for connection and nurturing roles that provide deep fulfillment, while men retain instincts toward provision and protection that, when unneeded, can be redirected toward personal projects without the same emotional void. The asymmetry becomes most apparent when women in their late 30s or 40s attempt to re enter the dating market with expectations shaped by earlier cultural promises. They seek partners who offer stability, emotional availability, and willingness to build a family, only to encounter the men who have already recalibrated their priorities around self sufficiency and low drama existence. The men explain, often politely but firmly, that they have no interest in stepping back into roles that expose them to financial risk, emotional labor demands, or legal vulnerabilities associated with modern marriage. They point to statistics on divorce initiation rates, asset division, child custody outcomes, and alimony as rational reasons to remain unattached. Conversations in online spaces frequented by men reveal a consistent theme of relief rather than resentment. They describe the moment they decided to stop pursuing relationships as liberating, akin to setting down a heavy burden they had been taught was their duty. They talk about reclaiming evenings once spent on dates that went nowhere, money previously allocated to dinners, and gifts now invested in personal development or savings, and mental space freed from decoding mixed signals or navigating shifting expectations. The peace they describe is not the bitter kind that comes from rejection, but the calm that arrives when external pressures lift and internal priorities take center place. Many maintain active social lives through male friendships, group activities, or online communities built around shared interests, proving that connection remains possible without romantic entanglement or family formation. They have effectively rewritten the social contract on their own terms, choosing quality over quantity in relationships and refusing to subsidize lifestyles that no longer align with mutual benefit. Women observing this shift from the outside often express frustration or confusion, wondering why men will not simply resume the provider role now that circumstances have changed. The answer lies in basic reciprocity and learned behavior. For decades, men absorbed the message that approaching women carried risks of accusation, rejection, or social penalty, that their desires were suspect, and that any attempt to lead or provide could be labeled controlling. They adapted by withdrawing effort, reducing risk exposure, and building lives that require minimal external validation. Reversing that withdrawal now would demand trust that the cultural environment has genuinely changed. Yet the same voices that once demanded independence continue to frame traditional masculinity as problematic. Men see no incentive to re engage under those conditions, especially when solitude has proven not only tolerable, but preferable. The dynamic has become self reinforcing, each year of disengagement making reconnection less likely and less appealing. Younger women entering adulthood today inherit this landscape, bombarded by contradictory signals. On one hand, they encounter viral content warning against repeating the mistakes of prior generations, urging early family formation and realistic expectations around partnership. On the other hand, institutional voices in education, media, and corporate diversity programs still emphasize career first paths, credential accumulation, and financial autonomy as the primary markers of success. The tension creates paralysis for some who delay decisions hoping for clarity that never arrives, or double down on the independence track out of fear that deviating will mark them as regressive. Meanwhile, biological clocks continue ticking, unaffected by ideological debates or economic forecasts. The women who heed the warnings earliest often find partners more readily because they signal willingness to build interdependent lives rather than parallel solo trajectories. Those who wait longest face steeper odds, not because men have become universally unavailable, but because the pool of willing, compatible partners shrinks as men commit to their chosen paths of simplicity and self direction. The broader societal implications extend far beyond individual happiness or relationship status. Shrinking birth rates accelerate aging populations. increasing dependency ratios where fewer working age people support more retirees through taxes and social programs. Economic growth slows when consumer bases contract and innovation suffers from reduced human capital replenishment. Cultural continuity weakens as fewer children inherit traditions, values, and collective memory from preceding generations. These outcomes were not the explicit goal of any single movement, yet they flow logically from widespread adoption of a worldview that treated family as optional rather than foundational. The experiment has run long enough to observe results, and the verdict is clear in declining happiness metrics, falling fertility, rising loneliness epidemics, and the growing chorus of voices urging course correction. Still, the conversation remains polarized because acknowledging these patterns challenges deeply held beliefs about progress and equality. Admitting that certain trade offs were oversold or that human nature imposes limits on social engineering invites accusations of nostalgia or anti feminism, even when the critique comes from women who live the consequences firsthand. Yet, the evidence accumulates regardless of rhetoric, visible in empty playgrounds, quiet family homes, and the faces of people reaching midlife without the relationships they once assumed would be there. The path forward requires honesty about what delivers lasting fulfillment rather than temporary validation, about the value of interdependence alongside individual achievement, and about the wisdom of aligning life choices with biological and psychological realities instead of ideological fashions. The pattern has solidified into something almost predictable at this point, a generational loop where idealism collides with biology and economics, producing outcomes that nobody planned, but everyone now lives with. Consider the women currently in their mid 20s who grew up watching the first wave of girl boss influencers hit their 30s and start sounding the alarm. They absorbed those early warnings through podcasts, viral threads, and late night scrolls, yet many still pursue the same blueprint because the incentives remain stacked in one direction. University programs continue to funnel young women into high credential fields with promises of six-figure starting salaries and leadership tracks. Corporate recruiters host women only networking events that frame career acceleration as the ultimate form of self actualization. Social media algorithms reward content showing solo apartments decorated to perfection, international work trips, and captions about owning every decision without compromise. The cultural machinery keeps spinning the same message even as the originators of that message begin to walk it back in private conversations or semi public apologies. The disconnect creates cognitive dissonance that resolves itself in different ways for different people. Some double down, insisting the regrets are exceptions rather than the rule, and that systemic barriers, not personal choices, explain the loneliness statistics. Others quietly adjust course, scaling back ambitions or seeking partnerships earlier than their older sisters did, hoping to thread the needle between achievement and family before the window narrows too far. This adjustment is not always easy because the social penalty for deviating from the independent script remains real. Women who express interest in early marriage or prioritizing family often face subtle or overt judgment from peers who view those choices as surrender or regression. They get labeled as settling, lacking ambition, or betraying the progress hard won by previous generations. The irony is thick, since the same progress narrative that celebrated breaking free from traditional constraints now quietly punishes anyone who chooses to reclaim elements of those constraints voluntarily. Yet the women who make that choice anyway frequently report higher life satisfaction in follow up surveys conducted years later. They describe relief at escaping the treadmill of constant performance reviews, networking obligations, and the pressure to always appear unbreakable. They talk about the unexpected depth that comes from building something lasting with another person, from watching a child grow, from sharing mundane routines that accumulate into genuine security. These stories rarely go viral because they do not fit neatly into empowerment aesthetics, but they circulate in smaller circles and influence siblings, cousins, and friends who witness the contrast up close. Men continue to observe this landscape with a mixture of detachment and quiet reinforcement of their own decisions. The ones who walked away early now occupy a position of strength they did not necessarily anticipate when they first opted out. They have years of compounding savings, debt free lifestyles, specialized skills in emerging fields, or simply the habit of living well below their means. Their social calendars fill with activities that require no negotiation, no emotional labor beyond what they choose to give, and no risk of sudden financial or legal entanglement. When conversations turn to relationships, they listen politely, offer observations drawn from data rather than emotion, and return to their own pursuits without guilt. They have internalized that offering provision in the current environment often means subsidizing a lifestyle that views that provision as entitlement rather than partnership. They see divorce courts where assets split unevenly despite equal contributions, custody arrangements that favor one parent by default, and ongoing financial obligations that extend decades past the end of the marriage itself. These realities, documented in public records and discussed openly in male oriented forums, function as a permanent deterrent. The cost benefit analysis no longer favors re engagement. Economic trends accelerate this separation further. Remote work, once a pandemic necessity, has become a structural shift that allows men to live in affordable regions while maintaining income from high cost urban employers. They relocate to mid sized cities or rural areas where housing consumes 20% of income instead of 50, where groceries stretch further, and where communities still value face to face interaction without the performative individualism of coastal metros. In these places, they form loose networks of like minded individuals who share tools, trade skills, and provide mutual aid without the expectations tied to romantic or familial roles. The lifestyle resembles a modern version of bachelor societies from earlier eras, except now it is sustained by digital connectivity and passive revenue streams rather than physical proximity alone. Women attempting similar moves face different calculations because safety concerns, biological clocks, and societal judgment weigh heavier when relocation means leaving established support networks behind. The result is geographic divergence that mirrors the relational one. Men spreading out into lower pressure environments while many women remain anchored in high cost centers, chasing opportunities that grow scarcer each year. Artificial intelligence enters this picture as both disruptor and amplifier. The jobs most vulnerable to automation over the next decade cluster in areas where women hold disproportionate representation, from data entry and basic accounting to customer service scripting and routine legal research. Entire categories of white collar work that once provided stability and status now face obsolescence, forcing mid career professionals to retrain or accept lower paying roles. Men who already exited traditional employment structures suffer less from this wave because they diversified earlier, building income from multiple small streams or mastering trades resistant to replacement. Plumbers, electricians, HVAC technicians, and specialized fabricators see demand rise as housing stock ages and infrastructure requires constant maintenance. These fields pay well, offer flexibility, and carry none of the corporate politics that drained so many before. The men who gravitated toward them report satisfaction rooted in tangible results, visible progress, and respect earned through competence rather than credentials. Women who enter these trades exist but remain a minority, partly because cultural messaging steered generations away from them toward office based paths now proving fragile. The loneliness statistics tell their own story without needing embellishment. Surveys tracking social isolation show women reporting higher rates of feeling profoundly alone compared to men in the same age brackets. The gap widens after age 35, precisely when the consequences of delayed family formation become hardest to ignore. Men in the same cohort report lower loneliness because they cultivate different forms of connection, often through shared activities or online communities that require less emotional intensity. They maintain friendships that endure for decades without daily maintenance, participate in hobbies that provide purpose, and find meaning in personal projects that do not depend on external approval. Women more frequently describe a hunger for deeper intimacy that friendships alone cannot satisfy, a need for someone to witness their lives in full rather than in fragments. The mismatch in expectations becomes clearest in dating interactions, where women seek commitment and men seek low stakes companionship, leading to mutual frustration that reinforces withdrawal on both sides. Policy responses to these trends lag far behind reality. Governments throw money at fertility incentives, offering tax credits, subsidized childcare, or extended parental leave. Yet participation rates remain low because the underlying issues are cultural and relational rather than purely financial. People do not decide to have children because the math works on paper. They do it when they feel secure in partnership, optimistic about the future, and convinced that bringing life into the world is a net positive rather than a sacrifice. When those preconditions erode, no amount of subsidy reverses the trend overnight. Immigration fills some labor gaps, but introduces its own tensions around cultural cohesion and resource allocation. Meanwhile, elder care systems strain under the weight of aging populations with fewer adult children available to assist, pushing more responsibility onto institutional solutions that deliver efficiency but rarely warmth. The women who speak out most forcefully against the path they once followed often do so with urgency born of personal loss. They describe miscarriages suffered while chasing promotions, relationships that ended because timing never aligned, or health declines linked to chronic stress and poor work life boundaries. Their warnings carry the weight of lived experience rather than abstract ideology, which makes them harder to dismiss. They tell younger women to guard their fertility like the finite resource it is, to prioritize partners who demonstrate reliability early, and to resist the temptation to measure worth solely through professional milestones. They acknowledge that some women thrive on the solo path, but insist those cases are outliers rather than the norm that should be promoted to everyone. The message gains traction in pockets of the internet where authenticity trumps polish, where people share unfiltered truths instead of curated success stories. Men listening to these warnings rarely feel compelled to act as saviors. They have spent years building defenses against precisely the kind of dynamic that produced the regret now being expressed. They recognize the pattern of devaluation, followed by sudden revaluation, and choose not to participate. Their stance is not cruel, it is pragmatic. They have seen too many examples of relationships built on unequal contribution, of legal systems that punish providers, of cultural narratives that frame masculinity as toxic until provision becomes convenient again. The trust required to re enter that arena has eroded beyond quick repair. Instead, they focus on what remains under their control: health, finances, skills, friendships, and the daily rhythm of a life designed for their own satisfaction. This equilibrium may persist for another generation or longer unless fundamental shifts occur in education, media, and incentive structures. Young men and women would need to receive balanced messaging about trade offs from an early age, one that honors both individual achievement and relational interdependence without elevating one at the expense of the other. Institutions would need to reward family formation rather than penalize it through tax codes, housing policy, and workplace norms. Cultural stories would need to celebrate committed partnerships and parenthood as sources of meaning rather than obstacles to be overcome. Until those changes arrive, the current divergence will likely deepen, with men continuing to refine lives of voluntary simplicity and women navigating the consequences of choices made under outdated assumptions. The cultural machinery keeps churning out contradictory signals, even as the ground shifts beneath it, creating a kind of quiet chaos for anyone trying to chart a sane course through their 20s and 30s. High schools and colleges still host panels on breaking barriers and owning your future, where success gets defined almost exclusively in terms of titles, salaries, and personal brands. Guidance counselors push STEM degrees and internships at prestigious firms as the surest route to security, rarely mentioning that those same paths now lead into sectors facing structural contraction. At the same time, the algorithm feeds endless reels of women in their late 30s posting raw, tear streaked videos about freezing eggs too late, about the ache of empty apartments during holidays, about realizing that the corner office view does not talk back at night. The juxtaposition is jarring yet normalized. One feed glorifying the climb, while another documents the view from the top when the climb ends in solitude. Young women navigate this split screen reality by compartmentalizing, telling themselves the regret stories belong to someone else, someone who did not hustle hard enough or network smart enough, while privately wondering if the timeline they are on matches the one nature assigned. Some pivot early and decisively. They meet someone solid in their mid 20s, weigh the trade offs with clear eyes, and decide that building a home base now outweighs stacking another credential or chasing a promotion that might never arrive. They move to more affordable regions where a single professional income still covers a house with a yard, where schools are decent and communities still exist outside digital echo chambers. They start families while their fertility remains high and their energy matches the demands of small children, then re enter the workforce part time or in flexible roles once the kids reach school age. The data on these women shows markedly lower rates of burnout, depression, and regret compared to peers who delayed everything. They report stronger marriages because the partnership formed during mutual growth rather than after one side had already peaked in independence and the other had settled into self contained routines. Their children grow up with both parents physically present during formative years, which longitudinal studies link to better emotional regulation, academic outcomes, and social competence down the line. These outcomes rarely make headlines because they lack drama, yet they represent a growing minority, quietly proving that alignment with biological and relational reality still delivers measurable returns. The majority, however, stay locked into the original script because the sunk costs are already enormous. Student loans from advanced degrees total six figures for many monthly payments, eat into take home pay. And the fear of defaulting or appearing to have wasted that investment keeps them tethered to high pressure jobs, even when the joy has long evaporated. They watch male colleagues or former classmates quietly exit corporate life for trades, online ventures, or geographic arbitrage, yet feel unable to follow because the credentials they accumulated tie them to office based roles that demand constant presence and performance. The gender skew in automation vulnerability becomes painfully clear here. Women hold roughly 70% of jobs classified as highly automatable in the next 10 to 15 years. Positions involving predictable data handling, routine analysis, or scripted customer interaction. Men dominate fields requiring physical presence, complex problem solving under uncertainty, or hands on expertise, sectors where artificial intelligence augments rather than replaces human labor. The displacement hits women harder and faster, pushing many into gig platforms, freelance hustles, or administrative roles that pay less than promised and offer zero upward mobility. This economic pressure collides with social isolation in ways that compound over time. Without a partner or children, discretionary income shrinks as inflation outpaces wage growth in feminized sectors, forcing choices between rent, groceries, and basic health care. Friend groups thin out as peers pair off, have kids, and redirect energy toward family obligations. The women left standing find themselves organizing brunches or group trips that feel increasingly forced, conversations circling the same topics because shared life experience has diverged so sharply. Mental health metrics reflect the strain. Rates of anxiety disorders, antidepressant prescriptions, and alcohol related hospitalizations climb steadily among never married women over 35, outpacing similar trends among men. The difference traces back to differing coping mechanisms and social wiring. Men lean into solitary or activity based outlets that recharge them without requiring deep emotional reciprocity. Women more often seek connection that mirrors the intimacy once expected from family structures. And when that connection remains elusive, the void feels existential rather than merely inconvenient. And policy attempts to bridge the gap keep falling short because they address symptoms instead of root causes. Paid family leave expands in some states, yet uptake remains low among higher earning professionals who fear career penalties. Child tax credits increase, but the amounts rarely offset the actual cost of raising children in urban environments. Housing initiatives target affordability, yet zoning laws and NIMBY resistance keep supply constrained, pricing young families out of desirable neighborhoods. Fertility treatments receive more insurance coverage, but success rates drop sharply after 35, and the emotional and financial toll of repeated cycles leaves many worse off than before. These measures assume people want children but lack resources, when the deeper issue for many is a lack of stable partnership and optimism about the future. Without those foundations, incentives alone do not move the needle. Men watching from the sidelines see no reason to reinsert themselves into a system that devalued their role until the moment it became convenient again. They point to the asymmetry in how contributions get framed. When men provide financially, they get labeled controlling or patriarchal. When they withdraw, they get labeled immature or selfish. When women prioritize career, they get celebrated as empowered. When men do the same, they get called avoidant. The double standard has become too obvious to ignore, so many men simply stop playing the game. They maintain cordial but distant relations with female friends and family, offer practical advice when asked, and otherwise invest in their own ecosystem. Online spaces dedicated to male self improvement explode with content about stoicism, financial independence, physical fitness, skill acquisition, and minimalist living. These communities provide the camaraderie once supplied by workplace or family obligations, minus the risk of betrayal, divorce, or financial ruin. The lifestyle they build emphasizes durability over flash. They buy used vehicles that last 10 years without drama, cook simple, nutritious meals in bulk, maintain small but efficient living spaces, and channel surplus income into index funds, real estate in secondary markets, or equipment for side projects. Travel becomes spontaneous rather than planned around someone else's schedule. Hobbies deepen into mastery, whether woodworking, martial arts, music production, or open source coding. The absence of constant relational negotiation frees cognitive bandwidth for long term thinking, resulting in net worth trajectories that often surpass those of married peers burdened by dual lifestyles or post divorce settlements. Happiness surveys consistently show single men in their 30s and 40s reporting higher life satisfaction than single women in the same bracket, a reversal from patterns observed in the 1980s and 90s. This reversal unsettles cultural commentators who built careers on narratives of female ascendance and male obsolescence. They frame the male withdrawal as a crisis of masculinity rather than a rational response to changed incentives. They call for re education programs, therapy mandates, or social campaigns to bring men back into traditional roles. Yet these proposals ignore the hard learned lessons that drove the exit in the first place. Men have seen the statistics on who initiates divorce, who receives primary custody, who pays alimony and child support, and who rebuilds from zero after asset division. They have read the stories of breadwinners discarded after decades of loyalty, of fathers alienated from children through legal maneuvering, of reputations destroyed by unsubstantiated allegations that carry no consequence for the accuser. Trust, once broken, does not regenerate on command. The men who walked away did so after repeated demonstrations that the system no longer rewarded their participation. Younger cohorts absorb these lessons faster than their predecessors. Boys growing up now watch fathers, uncles, or older brothers navigate post divorce realities or choose lifelong bachelorhood without apology. They see the appeal of keeping earnings, time, and emotional energy under personal control. Dating apps reflect the shift, with women outnumbering men in many age groups and swipe ratios heavily favoring female selectivity. Men respond by lowering investment, focusing on self presentation for casual encounters rather than long term courtship, or abandoning the platforms altogether. The result is a feedback loop where women complain about lacks of serious options and men conclude that serious pursuit carries too much downside. The long term societal bill for this divergence keeps growing. Pension systems designed around continuous workforce participation face shortfalls as fewer workers support more retirees. Healthcare infrastructure strains under chronic conditions linked to isolation and stress. Innovation slows when talent pools shrink, and risk taking declines among populations prioritizing security over exploration. Cultural narratives fragment as fewer shared experiences bind generations together. The experiment in hyper individualism has produced data points that are difficult to spin positively. Yet the institutions that promoted it show little appetite for fundamental course correction. Women who recognize the pattern midstream sometimes attempt damage control by broadening their search criteria, moving to regions with better gender ratios, or signaling openness to traditional dynamics. Success varies. Some find partners who value commitment over ego, build families, and report genuine contentment. Others encounter men too entrenched in independence to pivot or face biological timelines that no longer align with desire. The window for course correction narrows with each passing year, which is why the warnings from women in their 40s carry such urgency. They speak not out of bitterness, but out of a desire to spare others the same late stage clarity. The path of least resistance for now remains the current one. Men refining self contained lives and women grappling with the limits of independence in a world that still runs on interdependence, whether acknowledged or not. Breaking the cycle requires cultural honesty about what delivers enduring meaning, institutional reforms that stop penalizing family formation, and individual courage to choose differently despite social headwinds. Until those elements converge, the divergence will likely widen, each side adapting to its chosen reality with increasing conviction. The divergence we are witnessing is not merely personal or relational anymore. It has hardened into structural features of modern economies and demographics that will shape the next half century in ways few institutions are prepared to confront head on. Take the housing market as one clear example of how these choices cascade into broader dysfunction. In major metropolitan areas where women disproportionately cluster for career opportunities, demand for compact, high end, single occupancy units has driven prices to levels that would have been unthinkable 2 decades ago. Developers respond by converting family sized homes into micro apartments or luxury studios, reducing the overall stock of dwellings suitable for raising children. Zoning boards, influenced by resident coalitions that benefit from scarcity, resist new construction of larger homes or multi bedroom rentals, further locking in the pattern. Young couples who might otherwise start families find themselves priced out entirely or forced into long commutes that erode the very work life balance they seek. The irony is sharp. The independence celebrated in corporate boardrooms and lifestyle magazines has translated into physical environments that make interdependence logistically and financially punishing. Meanwhile, men who relocated earlier to lower cost regions enjoy homeownership rates that continue to climb, often purchasing properties with yards, workshops, or extra rooms they use for personal projects rather than dependents. Their equity builds steadily, while urban women watch rent consume larger portions of income that already faces downward pressure from automation. Education pipelines feed directly into this trap. Universities expanded enrollment in fields attractive to women: psychology, communications, human resources, education, social work, while trade schools and engineering programs remained male dominated. The result is a credential glut in sectors that offer limited earning power relative to debt loads. Average student loan balances for women now exceed those of men by roughly 10%, a gap that widens when graduate degrees enter the equation. Many women graduate into entry level roles that pay less than advertised, then spend years climbing toward mid level positions just as artificial intelligence begins eroding the middle rungs of those ladders. Retraining becomes necessary, but the time and money required for new certifications compete with biological timelines and the energy drain of solo living. Men who bypassed 4 year degrees or exited them early often enter skilled trades during peak earning years, accumulate certifications on the job, and reach six-figure incomes by their early 30s without equivalent debt. Their financial independence arrives sooner and lasts longer, reinforcing the decision to remain unattached. The contrast in net worth trajectories by age 40 becomes stark, with single men pulling ahead in liquid assets, retirement accounts, and real property, while single women contend with negative or flat equity after years of rent and loan payments. Healthcare systems feel the strain next. Chronic loneliness correlates strongly with elevated inflammation markers, weakened immune response, higher blood pressure, and accelerated cognitive decline. Women report these conditions at higher rates after age 35, when social networks contract and family support is absent. Emergency rooms see more solo admissions for stress related issues, panic attacks misdiagnosed as heart problems, gastrointestinal disorders tied to anxiety, sleep disturbances that resist medication. Primary care physicians note increasing numbers of women in their 40s seeking hormone replacement or fertility consultations, only to learn that diminished ovarian reserve leaves few viable options. The financial burden of these interventions falls entirely on the individual when no partner shares the cost or provides emotional scaffolding during treatment cycles. Men in comparable age groups present with different profiles, higher rates of injury from physical hobbies or manual labor, but lower incidence of isolation linked disorders. They utilize preventive care less frequently, yet report fewer subjective health complaints, possibly because structured routines, physical activity, and male peer groups buffer against psychological wear. The gender health gap that once favored women in longevity statistics narrows as lifestyle and relational factors outweigh biological advantages. Pension and social security systems loom as the next pressure point. Actuaries have warned for years that pay as you go retirement programs depend on a stable or growing worker to retiree ratio. When fertility remains below replacement for multiple decades, the ratio inverts dramatically. By mid century, the United States is projected to have roughly 2 workers per retiree in some scenarios, down from more than 5 in the 1960s. Women who remained childless or had one child late contribute to the worker side longer, but then transition to the retiree side without adult children to supplement income or provide in kind care. Nursing homes and assisted living facilities expand rapidly, yet staffing shortages persist because younger cohorts are smaller and many prefer flexible gig work over low wage caregiving roles. Men who downsized lifestyles and saved aggressively fare better under these constraints, drawing smaller but sustainable benefits supplemented by private investments. Those who maintained lean habits avoid the poverty trap that awaits women reliant on state pensions after careers in underpaid, feminized sectors. The coming elder care crisis will disproportionately burden women, both as patients lacking family advocates and as workers trapped in grueling, poorly compensated jobs. Cultural production reflects and reinforces the split. Streaming platforms and publishing houses continue to greenlight content that glorifies solo female journeys. Dramas about ambitious lawyers navigating heartbreak, comedies about friend groups aging together without partners, reality shows celebrating child free luxury travel. These stories resonate with audiences who live them, yet they rarely depict the long tail of those choices. The quiet evenings when friends are unavailable, the hospital visits attended alone, the realization that legacy ends with one's own life rather than extending through descendants. Male oriented content shifts towards self reliance archetypes, documentaries on off grid living, tutorials on financial independence, podcasts dissecting relationship risks with forensic detail. The two streams rarely intersect except in comment sections where debates flare briefly before algorithms separate the audiences again. Shared cultural touchstones erode, replaced by parallel realities where one side sees progress and the other sees prudent adaptation. Workplace dynamics evolve in tandem. Companies that once competed for female talent with diversity quotas and family friendly policies now quietly scale back as talent pools shrink and budgets tighten. Maternity leave policies remain on paper, but carry unspoken career penalties in high stakes environments. Remote work, while still common, concentrates in roles resistant to automation, leaving many women in hybrid or in person positions that demand constant visibility and emotional labor. Men gravitate toward contract, consulting, or entrepreneurial structures that allow complete control over hours and output. The result is a bifurcated labor market. One track of precarious, visible employment dominated by women chasing stability that recedes, and another track of flexible, autonomous work dominated by men who have already internalized low commitment living. Productivity metrics mask the human cost, showing aggregate output while hiding burnout, turnover, and quiet quitting among those unable to exit. International comparisons sharpen the picture. Nations that maintained stronger cultural emphasis on family, Japan, South Korea, Italy, face even steeper fertility declines and more acute aging crises because their social norms still expect women to shoulder disproportionate domestic loads even after entering the workforce. Western countries that pushed individualism furthest experienced the relational fallout most intensely. Yet they also show the clearest signs of male disengagement as a counterbalance. Eastern European nations, with lower costs of living and lingering traditional expectations, see higher marriage and birth rates among younger cohorts, suggesting that economic affordability combined with cultural continuity can slow the trend. No single model reverses the decline overnight, but the variation proves that outcomes depend on incentives, messaging, and structural support rather than inevitable progress or collapse. The women who speak loudest against the girl boss legacy often do so from positions of partial recovery. They may have found late partnerships, adopted children, or built chosen families through deep friendships and community involvement. Their testimonies carry authenticity because they lived both sides. The exhilaration of early independence followed by the hollowing out, then the deliberate rebuilding toward interdependence. They emphasize practical steps, vetting partners for character over charisma, prioritizing emotional availability over earning potential, accepting trade offs without apology. Their advice circulates in private groups and niche podcasts rather than mainstream outlets, yet it influences small but growing numbers who decide to act before regret sets in permanently. Men remain largely unmoved by these appeals. They have recalibrated expectations downward and found the new baseline superior to the old one. The prospect of re entering a dynamic where provision is demanded but respect is conditional holds little appeal. They continue refining systems of self sufficiency, mentoring younger men in the same principles, and watching from a distance as the consequences play out. Their stance is one of resolved detachment, not hostility. They wish no ill on anyone. They simply decline to serve as backup plans after being told for decades that backup was unnecessary. This steady state equilibrium may hold until external shocks, economic collapse, geopolitical realignment, technological breakthroughs in longevity or fertility force a reevaluation. Absent those catalysts, the slow separation continues. Each generation learning from the last, yet constrained by the same institutional inertia and cultural lag. The cost of maintaining the illusion of costless independence grows higher, paid in loneliness, financial fragility, demographic contraction, and quiet erosion of social fabric. Acknowledging that cost openly remains the first step toward any meaningful reset. Yet the willingness to do so publicly still lags far behind the private recognition that spreads year by year. The institutional lag in recognizing these structural realities creates a kind of slow motion crisis that unfolds in boardrooms, legislative chambers, and family courtrooms alike, each operating under assumptions that crystallized in the late 20th century and have yet to fully update. Corporate human resources departments still roll out mandatory training modules on unconscious bias and work life integration, framing the primary challenge as helping women ascend higher without acknowledging that the ladder itself is shortening from the middle outward due to technological displacement and economic recalibration. Executives approve budgets for employee resource groups dedicated to women's advancement while quietly reducing headcount in support functions where women predominate, citing efficiency gains from software that handles scheduling, reporting, and basic compliance checks without fatigue or salary demands. The rhetoric of empowerment persists in annual reports and shareholder letters, yet the actual composition of remaining roles tilts toward positions requiring either elite technical expertise or relentless interpersonal navigation, domains where burnout rates climb fastest for those already carrying the heavier load of solo living. Legislatures grapple with the fallout through piecemeal measures that address optics more than mechanics. Proposals to cap alimony duration or introduce presumption of shared custody gain traction in some states, yet face resistance from advocacy organizations that frame any adjustment as rollback of hard won protections. The debate rarely touches the upstream cause, the declining willingness of men to enter legally binding provider roles when the risk reward equation has shifted so decisively against them. Family courts continue to process cases under guidelines that assume one primary caregiver and one financial supporter, a model that made sense when dual, full time careers were less common and cultural expectations aligned with it. Today, those assumptions produce outcomes that feel punitive to the higher earner, often still the man, even in dual income households, while leaving the lower earner or non earner with custody advantages that discourage mutual investment from the start. Men observe these patterns through public records, legal forums, and personal networks that adjust behavior preemptively by avoiding marriage contracts altogether or structuring relationships with ironclad financial separation from day one. The courts see fewer contested divorces, not because harmony has increased, but because fewer marriages form in the first place. Religious and community institutions that once served as default anchors for family life now contend with shrinking congregations and aging memberships. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples report steady declines in attendance among people under 45, particularly in urban and suburban areas where career mobility and digital distraction compete most fiercely. Programs designed to support young families, parenting classes, youth groups, marriage enrichment retreats operate with reduced participation because fewer people reach those life stages at the ages when such support would have maximum impact. Clergy adapt by offering more content online, framing spiritual growth in individual rather than communal terms. Yet the loss of in person networks deprives participants of the organic matchmaking and social accountability that historically facilitated early partnerships. Secular equivalents, community centers, hobby clubs, volunteer organizations face similar contraction as people default to solitary or virtual engagement. The erosion of third spaces leaves fewer natural venues for meeting potential long term partners outside algorithm driven platforms that prioritize short term chemistry over sustained compatibility. Media consumption patterns mirror and magnify the divide. Streaming services invest heavily in narratives that center solitary female protagonists navigating professional triumph and personal ambiguity, stories that resonate deeply with viewers living parallel experiences. These shows rarely conclude with traditional resolutions. Instead, they end on notes of self acceptance, ambiguous futures, or redefined success that excludes partnership and parenthood. Male targeted content leans towards survivalism, financial independence tutorials, skill building challenges, and critiques of modern relational dynamics presented with clinical detachment. The two ecosystems coexist with minimal crossover, each reinforcing its audience's worldview while rarely challenging core premises. Traditional news outlets cover the fertility crisis and loneliness epidemic through lenses of policy failure or economic inequality, seldom connecting the dots back to the cultural messaging that shaped individual decisions over decades. Op-eds debate whether governments should subsidize dating apps, mandate paternity leave expansions, or launch national campaigns promoting marriage. Yet these proposals treat symptoms while the underlying incentive structure remains untouched. Technological adaptation accelerates on the male side of the equation in ways that further entrench separation. Men who embraced remote work early now leverage advances in virtual collaboration tools to maintain income streams from anywhere with reliable internet. They experiment with decentralized finance platforms for passive yield, build automated trading scripts for supplemental revenue, or create content libraries that generate ad and subscription income with minimal ongoing effort. These experiments require upfront learning curves, but reward persistence with compounding returns that do not depend on corporate approval or relational stability. Women attempting similar pivots face steeper barriers when starting from higher debt loads, less accumulated technical fluency in certain domains, and greater pressure to maintain visible employment for social and financial validation. The result is a widening gap in financial resilience. Men increasingly insulated from economic volatility through diversified, low maintenance income. Women more exposed when primary employment falters. Urban planning and transportation infrastructure subtly reinforce the pattern. Cities that grew around commuter rail and highway systems optimized for dual earner households now struggle to retrofit for single occupancy dominance. Public transit ridership recovers unevenly, with women more likely to rely on it for daily commutes, while men concentrate in regions where personal vehicles or bikes suffice. Bike share programs and scooter networks expand in dense cores, catering to short solo trips rather than family errands. Grocery delivery and meal kit services thrive on single portion economics, reducing the need for large kitchens or storage that family homes require. Retail spaces shrink square footage for apparel and home goods targeted at individuals, while big box stores serving families consolidate or relocate to exurban edges. The built environment gradually rewires itself around the reality of fewer households with children, fewer shared vehicles, and fewer multi generational living arrangements. International migration adds another layer of complexity. Developed nations facing acute labor shortages increasingly rely on skilled immigrants to fill gaps in healthcare, education, and technology. Yet these inflows do not automatically resolve relational or fertility shortfalls. Immigrants often arrive with cultural expectations of family centrality that clash with host country norms of hyper individualism, leading to hybrid patterns where first generation arrivals form families at higher rates while their children assimilate toward lower fertility. Native born populations observe these differences and sometimes adjust behavior, some adopting more traditional family models inspired by immigrant communities, others doubling down on independence as a point of cultural distinction. The interplay creates pockets of demographic resilience amid broader contraction, yet overall trends continue downward. The psychological literature on meaning and well being offers perhaps the clearest diagnostic lens. Decades of research converge on a handful of reliable predictors of long term life satisfaction. Deep relationships, perceived contribution to something larger than oneself, mastery of valued skills, and basic autonomy over daily life. Modern independence delivers the last two in abundance for many, particularly men who redesign existence around personal mastery and control. Yet it systematically underdelivers the first two for large segments of women who internalized the promise that professional mastery alone could substitute for relational depth and legacy building. The mismatch manifests in elevated rates of existential distress, searches for purpose through travel or philanthropy that provide temporary relief but rarely fill the core void, and a pervasive sense that something essential remains missing despite external markers of success. Women reaching this realization in their late 30s or early 40s sometimes undertake deliberate life redesigns. They relocate to smaller cities with stronger community fabric, join religious or secular groups that emphasize mutual support, or pursue partnerships with men who share revised priorities around family and balance. Success depends heavily on timing, flexibility, and willingness to accept non ideal matches rather than holding out for perfect alignment. Those who succeed often describe the transition as humbling yet liberating, trading performative independence for reciprocal dependence that proves more durable. Those who delay too long or cannot find workable arrangements face starker choices: acceptance of permanent solitude, pursuit of single parenthood through adoption or assisted reproduction, or retreat into increasingly narrow routines that preserve stability at the cost of vitality. Men, for their part, continue to refine the art of sustainable minimalism. They track net worth monthly, optimize tax advantaged accounts, maintain physical conditioning as insurance against future health costs, and cultivate friendships that endure without daily demands. Their days blend productive work with deliberate leisure in proportions that previous generations rarely achieved. The absence of relational friction allows clearer, long range planning, from early semi retirement to multi decade travel circuits to eventual relocation to low tax, high amenity regions. They mentor younger men informally through online channels, sharing frameworks for risk assessment, boundary setting, and value clarification that prioritize personal sovereignty above societal scripts. This bifurcated adaptation may represent the new normal until demographic weight forces systemic reevaluation. When retiree populations swell and worker bases shrink, pressure will mount to reconfigure tax codes, immigration policies, elder care models, and education systems around the reality of smaller cohorts and fewer traditional households. Whether that reevaluation restores balance between individual freedom and collective continuity or accelerates fragmentation depends on the honesty with which societies confront the data already in hand. The experiment has yielded unambiguous results. Hyper individualism scales poorly when biology, economics, and human psychology pull in opposing directions. Course correction requires acknowledging those tensions rather than denying them under banners of progress that no longer convince even their original proponents. The quiet restructuring of everyday institutions continues to reveal itself in places few people look until the effects become unavoidable. Consider public education systems, which were originally designed around the expectation of stable two parent households with one or both adults available for involvement in parent teacher conferences, volunteer opportunities, fundraising drives, and after school programs, all assumed a pool of family members with flexible time and emotional bandwidth to participate. As single occupancy households rise and dual full time careers become the default, even when partnerships exist, participation rates have dropped steadily. Teachers report fewer adults showing up for open houses, fewer chaperones for field trips, and fewer hands helping with classroom events. Schools respond by professionalizing more functions, hiring additional aides, outsourcing enrichment activities, or simply scaling back non academic offerings. Yet the relational fabric weakens. Children raised in environments with less consistent parental presence absorb different lessons about interdependence, authority, and community contribution. Longitudinal data tracks these cohorts into adulthood, showing correlations with higher rates of transactional relationships, lower civic engagement, and greater reliance on institutional or digital substitutes for social support. The system was never built to compensate fully for absent or overstretched families, and the gap widens with each passing year. Higher education follows a parallel trajectory. Enrollment in liberal arts and social science programs remains heavily female, while men gravitate toward vocational certificates, online micro credentials, or direct entry into trades and tech boot camps. Universities market themselves aggressively to women with promises of empowerment, networking events, and leadership institutes, yet graduation outcomes tell a different story. Women earn the majority of bachelor's and master's degrees, but hold a shrinking share of high compensation roles in fields resistant to automation. The credentials they accumulate often lead to public sector or nonprofit employment where pay ceilings are lower and advancement depends on seniority rather than innovation. Debt servicing consumes disposable income for decades, delaying home ownership, family formation, or even geographic mobility. Men who skip or minimize formal higher education frequently reach financial independence earlier, using earnings to build assets rather than service liabilities. The resulting wealth disparity by mid 30s becomes structural, not merely individual, influencing everything from dating market dynamics to political preferences and retirement security. Tax and welfare systems, engineered in an era of higher marriage rates and more children per household, now operate under mismatched assumptions. Progressive tax brackets and earned income credits were calibrated around family units that pooled resources and shared expenses. Single filers, particularly women in mid career plateaus, face effective marginal rates that discourage additional effort or side income. Childless adults receive fewer deductions and credits, while programs like housing vouchers or food assistance prioritize households with dependents. The incentives push toward either early family formation or complete withdrawal from traditional labor markets. Men who opt for gig, freelance, or entrepreneurial structures often structure income to stay below thresholds that trigger higher taxation or benefit phase outs, preserving more take home pay than salaried peers. Women remaining in W 2 employment rarely enjoy the same flexibility, locked into payroll deductions and visibility requirements that limit strategic maneuvering. Over time, the system rewards detachment from conventional employment more than persistence within it, accelerating the very workforce exits that strain revenue bases further. Insurance markets adapt in subtle but telling ways. Life, disability, and long term care policies once assumed spousal or familial fallback options. Actuaries now adjust premiums upward for single applicants, reflecting higher statistical risk of unsupported health events or extended recovery periods. Women purchasing individual policies face steeper costs than men in comparable health brackets, partly because longevity differences combine with isolation risks to elevate projected claims. Health insurers observe rising utilization of mental health services among never married women over 30, leading to tighter pre authorization requirements and narrower networks for therapy providers. Men report lower utilization of these services, possibly due to different help seeking patterns or because structured routines and peer accountability reduce the incidence of acute episodes. The cost differential reinforces male financial advantages, allowing greater allocation to investments rather than premiums or out of pocket care. The gig and creator economies, often celebrated as democratizing forces, reveal their own asymmetries. Platforms for freelance writing, graphic design, virtual assistants, and social media management draw heavy female participation because they promise flexibility around traditional office hours. Yet earnings remain volatile, with most workers clustering at the lower end after platform fees, competition from global talent, and algorithm changes that favor established accounts. Men who enter these spaces often focus on higher barrier niches, software development, technical consulting, niche e commerce, or automated content systems that yield more consistent returns with less daily grind. The difference stems partly from prior skill acquisition and risk tolerance, but also from differing opportunity costs. Women balancing gig work with corporate day jobs face burnout faster, while men who exited corporate structures earlier treat gig income as supplemental rather than primary, preserving leverage and mental bandwidth. Top earners in these ecosystems skew male in technical domains and female in lifestyle or relational content. Yet median outcomes favor those who diversified early and maintained low overhead. Leisure industries shift to serve the growing solo demographic with precision. Travel companies launch women only retreats, solo traveler insurance packages, and curated group tours marketed as safe alternatives to couple centric vacations. Fitness apps and boutique studios emphasize self care and empowerment branding, filling the emotional space once occupied by family oriented activities. Subscription boxes deliver single portion gourmet meals, premium skincare routines, and hobby kits designed for individual enjoyment. These markets thrive because they meet real demand, yet they also normalize and monetize isolation rather than challenging its root causes. Men gravitate toward different leisure patterns, overlanding vehicles, home gym builds, competitive gaming leagues, or skill based outdoor pursuits that emphasize mastery and low social overhead. The industries catering to them grow steadily but remain less visible in mainstream advertising, which prioritizes narratives of female self discovery and transformation. The legal profession itself begins to reflect these changes internally. Law schools graduate classes that are majority female, yet partnership tracks at major firms remain male dominated due to billable hour demands that clash with biological and relational timelines. Women attorneys report higher rates of leaving big law for government, in house, or solo practices after 5 to 10 years, often citing unsustainable hours and lack of mentorship for family considerations. Men who stay longer accumulate book of business and equity stakes that provide long term security. The attrition pattern reinforces wealth concentration among men who endure the grind or exit strategically into lower pressure roles. Family law practices see steady caseloads from late divorces among couples who delayed marriage and children, with asset division complicated by unequal career trajectories and premarital debt. Mediation services grow as parties seek to avoid court mandated outcomes that feel increasingly misaligned with modern realities. Environmental and sustainability movements intersect with these trends in unexpected ways. Single occupancy households consume more resources per capita, higher energy use for individual heating and cooling, more packaging waste from single serve products, greater land footprint for low density living. Advocacy groups focused on reducing carbon footprints promote co living arrangements, yet cultural preferences for privacy and autonomy limit adoption. Men who relocated to rural or semi rural areas often adopt off grid or low impact setups, solar panels, rainwater collection, wood heat that align personal independence with ecological efficiency. Women remaining in urban cores rely more on municipal utilities and delivery services, creating a paradoxical situation where the most independent lifestyles sometimes leave larger environmental marks. The tension highlights how individual choices aggregate into collective outcomes that no single person controls. The cumulative weight of these interlocking shifts points toward a future where social contract assumptions must evolve or fracture. Governments may experiment with universal basic services, negative income taxes, or radical housing deregulation to stabilize populations and economies. Cultural institutions could pivot towards celebrating interdependence as strength rather than dependence, reframing family and community as enhancements to individual achievement rather than competitors. Educational reforms might balance credential pathways with practical life preparation, teaching trade offs explicitly instead of implying that all goals are simultaneously achievable. Until those adaptations arrive, individuals continue navigating the landscape as best they can. Some forging resilient solo paths, others rebuilding relational foundations against headwinds, and most quietly adapting to a world that looks increasingly different from the one promised to them in their formative years. The consequences ripple outward into realms that once seemed insulated from relational and demographic shifts, but now bear their imprint unmistakably. Look at the insurance industry's actuarial tables, which have begun incorporating marital status and parental history as predictive variables with increasing weight. Single adults without children consistently show higher lifetime healthcare utilization patterns, not from dramatic acute events, but from the steady accumulation of stress related conditions that lack the buffering effect of daily companionship and shared responsibility. Premiums for individual disability and long term care policies have risen disproportionately for this cohort, reflecting data showing longer recovery times from illnesses or injuries when no one is present to assist with basic needs during convalescence. Women in this demographic face particularly steep increases because statistical life expectancy combines with higher reported rates of autoimmune disorders, mental health episodes, and musculoskeletal issues tied to chronic cortisol elevation. The financial mathematics become unforgiving. Policies that once seemed optional now border on mandatory for anyone without a built in support network, diverting dollars that could otherwise compound in retirement accounts or fund geographic moves toward lower cost living. Pension fund managers confront a mirror image problem on the liability side. Defined benefit plans from earlier decades promised payouts calibrated around joint life annuities that assumed spousal survivors would inherit reduced benefits. As more retirees enter the system never married or childless, the actuarial life expectancy stretches longer without the mortality crossover that occurs in coupled households. Funds originally projected to remain solvent now face shortfalls unless contribution rates rise, benefits are trimmed, or investment returns exceed historical averages for sustained periods. State and municipal retirement systems, already strained by underfunding in many jurisdictions, feel this pressure most acutely in regions where women dominate public sector employment. Teachers, nurses, social workers, and administrative staff who spent careers contributing faithfully now approach retirement to discover that the promised security rests on demographic assumptions no longer valid. Private sector 401k participants fare better when they maximized contributions early and diversified aggressively, a strategy more common among men who exited traditional employment paths sooner and redirected earnings towards self managed portfolios. The commercial real estate sector quietly recalibrates around the same demographic math. Office vacancy rates in central business districts hover at levels once considered catastrophic, driven partly by remote work, but also by the shrinking pool of workers in their prime earning years. Developers who once banked on perpetual demand for Class A tower space now pivot toward adaptive reuse, converting empty floors into co living residences, medical suites for aging in place services, or logistics hubs for last mile delivery that serves the growing number of single occupancy households ordering daily necessities. Retail footprints shrink as well. Big box stores give way to smaller format locations optimized for quick grabs rather than family shopping carts. Shopping malls already challenged by e commerce, see anchor tenants depart while pop up experiences and experiential entertainment attempt to fill the void. Yet foot traffic continues to reflect fewer large groups and more solitary visitors. The physical reshaping of cities around smaller household sizes accelerates urban depopulation in certain corridors while concentrating density in others, creating pockets of vibrancy surrounded by hollowed out neighborhoods where family oriented amenities have vanished. Transportation planners encounter parallel distortions. Public transit agencies designed routes and schedules assuming bidirectional commuter flows tied to traditional 9 to 5 office patterns and school drop off routines. As men increasingly work remotely or from secondary locations and women remain anchored to urban cores for remaining stable employment, peak hour demand becomes lopsided and unpredictable. Ridership forecasts miss repeatedly, leading to service cuts that further discourage use and create vicious cycles of declining revenue. Ride sharing and micromobility options expand to serve point to point solo trips. Yet surge pricing during off peak hours discourages spontaneous social outings that might otherwise combat isolation. Bike lanes and pedestrian corridors proliferate in dense areas, catering to individuals moving alone rather than families pushing strollers or walking children to school. The infrastructure built for a society of coupled households now serves a population increasingly composed of autonomous units, forcing costly retrofits that strain municipal budgets already pressed by shrinking tax bases. Food systems adapt with similar precision. Grocery chains expand private label lines of single serve frozen meals, pre portioned produce packs, and snack formats designed for one. Meal kit companies refine algorithms to suggest recipes requiring minimal leftovers, reducing food waste for solo cooks while increasing per meal costs compared to bulk family preparation. Urban farming initiatives and community supported agriculture programs struggle to find enough subscribers when fewer households cook regular family dinners. Restaurants shift toward bar seating, small plate sharing concepts, and takeout heavy models that accommodate eating alone without stigma. Fast casual chains thrive on customizable bowls and wraps that feel personal rather than communal. The entire supply chain, from farm to fork, tilts towards smaller units, raising unit costs and reducing efficiency gains once achieved through economies of scale in larger household consumption. Energy utilities observe comparable micro shifts that aggregate into macro challenges. Single occupancy dwellings use more electricity per person for heating, cooling, lighting, and appliance standby power because fixed loads do not divide across multiple occupants. Peak demand flattens somewhat without synchronized family routines, but becomes harder to forecast as individual schedules diverge wildly. Solar adoption grows among men who relocated to sunnier, lower cost regions and installed panels as part of self sufficient setups, while urban renters, disproportionately women, rely on grid power with limited ability to invest in on site generation. Demand response programs struggle to enroll participants who lack the flexibility of shared household decision making. The transition to renewables requires massive grid upgrades to handle more distributed and variable loads, costs passed through to ratepayers already facing inflation in other essentials. The nonprofit and philanthropy sectors feel the downstream pressure most intimately. Organizations focused on children's welfare, domestic violence shelters, elder services, and food banks report rising caseloads from demographics that once relied on family buffers. Donations from high net worth individuals remain robust, yet the middle tier of giving Historically driven by family units with disposable income, contracts as fewer households reach that threshold. Volunteer pools age and shrink, with fewer young parents available for mentoring programs or youth sports coaching. Fundraising galas and community events draw smaller crowds, forcing reliance on corporate sponsorships and major gifts that come with strings attached. The charitable landscape slowly professionalizes further, replacing grassroots involvement with paid staff and technology platforms. Yet, the loss of organic human connection mirrors the broader societal pattern. Media measurement companies track audience fragmentation that parallels the relational one. Streaming viewership data shows women over 35 clustering around character driven dramas, exploring solitude, ambition, and late life reevaluation, while men in the same age range gravitate toward documentaries on self reliance, historical survival stories, and technical deep dives. News consumption splits along similar lines, with women more likely to follow coverage of social policy, healthcare access, and gender equity, while men gravitate toward economic trends, geopolitical risk, and personal finance optimization. Advertising dollars follow eyeballs, reinforcing echo chambers that make shared cultural conversations rarer. The common ground, once provided by network television and mass market magazines, has eroded, leaving fewer unifying narratives that might bridge diverging life experiences. The cumulative effect across these domains creates a feedback loop that entrenches the original divergence. Each institutional adaptation normalizes smaller households, solo decision making, and reduced interdependence, which in turn reduces the perceived need for family formation or long term partnership. Incentives align around individual optimization rather than to collective resilience. Young people observing this landscape absorb the lesson implicitly. Build a life that stands alone because the systems around you increasingly assume it will. The cultural momentum favors self contained success stories, even as private conversations reveal mounting unease about where those stories ultimately lead. Women who recognize the pattern before it fully solidifies sometimes engineer deliberate counter moves. They seek out intentional communities, co housing developments, religious fellowships, or professional networks that double as social anchors, where mutual aid replaces absent family structures. They prioritize geographic moves toward regions where housing affordability aligns with family friendly policies and cultural norms still value partnership. They vet potential partners with forensic clarity, focusing on demonstrated reliability, emotional steadiness, and shared vision rather than surface charisma or earning potential alone. When successful, these efforts produce stable unions that weather economic turbulence better than purely transactional arrangements. The children raised in such households inherit different defaults. Early exposure to reciprocity, collective responsibility, and the security of multiple adults invested in their well being. Men who have already committed to autonomous paths rarely reverse course absent profound external shocks. They continue compounding advantages financial, temporal, psychological, while mentoring younger men to do the same. Their lives achieve a kind of austere elegance, disciplined routines, meaningful pursuits, low drama, high control. The absence of relational obligations allows experimentation with lifestyles that would otherwise collapse under competing demands. They travel light, invest boldly, rest deeply, and face the future with equanimity born of preparation rather than denial. This equilibrium persists because it solves immediate problems for individuals, even as it creates long term dilemmas for societies. Breaking it requires coordinated honesty across education, policy, media, and culture. Honesty that names trade offs plainly, honors biological realities without apology, and reframes interdependence as maturity rather than weakness. Until that honesty arrives at scale, the slow separation continues, each side adapting with increasing sophistication to a world shaped by choices made decades ago. The institutional adaptations we have examined so far represent only the visible surface of a deeper reconfiguration that touches even the most intimate layers of human experience. Sleep patterns, meal timing, exercise habits, reading choices, and the small daily rituals that once anchored people to shared rhythms. When households shrink to one occupant, circadian alignment loses its external cues. No longer does the sound of a partner stirring prompt an earlier rise, or the presence of children enforce consistent bedtimes. Solo dwellers frequently report fragmented sleep, later bedtimes drifting toward midnight or beyond, and wake times dictated more by alarm necessity than natural light or mutual obligation. Wearable device data, aggregated across millions of users, shows single adults averaging 45 minutes less consolidated sleep per night than coupled counterparts, with higher variability night to night. The absence of someone to share the transition from wakefulness to rest removes a subtle accountability mechanism that historically stabilized rest cycles. Over years, this compounds into measurable differences in cognitive sharpness, mood regulation, immune function, and metabolic health. Men who have embraced structured minimalism often counteract this drift through deliberate routines, fixed wind down times, blue light blocking, consistent pre sleep reading, while women in high pressure urban employment more often report irregular schedules driven by late meetings, commuting unpredictability, and the mental load of managing every household task without division of labor. Meal preparation follows a similar divergence. Family cooking once revolved around batch processes, larger cuts of meat, whole pots of grains, vegetables prepped in volume for multiple servings across days. Solo cooking shifts toward quick assembly methods, microwave steaming, single pan sautés, protein shakes blended on demand that minimize cleanup but sacrifice nutritional density and flavor complexity. Micronutrient intake suffers in predictable ways. Lower consumption of fiber rich whole foods, reduced variety in phytonutrients, higher reliance on processed convenience items that deliver calories without satiety signals calibrated for human biology. Grocery receipts from single occupancy households show higher per calorie expenditure and greater packaging waste per meal. Men who relocated to lower cost areas and adopted bulk buying habits for long shelf life staples often maintain better nutrient profiles at lower cost, while urban women juggling long work hours lean toward delivery apps that charge premiums for portioned perfection. The result is not starvation, but a slow erosion of physical resilience that manifests later as inflammation markers, climbing, energy crashes becoming routine, and recovery from illness taking longer without the built in rest that family obligations sometimes force. Physical activity patterns split along parallel lines. Gym memberships and home equipment purchases reflect different philosophies. Men gravitate towards strength focused setups, barbells, pull up rigs, heavy bags that require space and commitment but deliver measurable progress in raw power and metabolic health. Their routines emphasize compound lifts, progressive overload, and recovery periods that align with lower stress lifestyles. Women in dense urban environments more frequently choose boutique classes, spin studios, yoga flows, or running clubs that provide social scaffolding alongside movement. These options deliver community and endorphin release, but often at higher recurring cost and with less emphasis on building absolute strength that protects against age related sarcopenia. Data from fitness trackers indicates men in autonomous lifestyles logging higher weekly resistance training volume, while women report more total cardio minutes but lower overall muscle mass preservation. The long term divergence shows in bone density scans, grip strength norms, and functional mobility scores by age 50, where men who prioritized heavy lifting maintain advantages that reduce fall risk and preserve independence during potential later life health events. Reading and intellectual consumption diverge in content and cadence as well. Men who exited traditional structures often report deeper dives into long form nonfiction, economic history, systems thinking, biography, technical manuals that reward sustained focus and reward self directed learning. Their consumption patterns favor books over articles, physical copies over screens when possible, and deliberate note taking systems that compound knowledge over years. Women navigating corporate or institutional ladders more often consume bite sized professional development content, leadership podcasts during commutes, industry newsletters skimmed between meetings, motivational audiobooks played at 1.5x speed. The difference is not intelligence, but allocation. One path builds broad contextual understanding that informs independent decision making. The other hones domain specific skills that remain tethered to employer needs. Over a decade, the gap in general knowledge breadth becomes noticeable in conversations, problem solving approaches, and adaptability when external conditions change abruptly. Social media engagement reflects these same splits. Platforms algorithmically reinforce existing trajectories. Men who prioritize peace curate feeds heavy on mechanical tutorials, financial independence case studies, wilderness photography, and Stoic philosophy, quotes that align with self mastery themes. Their interaction remains low volume but high signal, saving posts for later reference rather than rapid fire commenting. Women in professional networks maintain higher daily active time, engaging with career advice threads, wellness influencers, relationship discussion forums, and curated lifestyle content that blends aspiration with commiseration. The emotional labor of maintaining these digital presences, responding thoughtfully, curating an authentic yet polished persona, adds another layer of cognitive overhead that men largely sidestep by keeping profiles minimal or private. The result is a paradox: greater visibility correlating with greater reported loneliness, as performative connection substitutes for but does not replace in person reciprocity. Holidays and seasonal rhythms, once communal anchors, become quieter inflection points. Major observances, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, shift from multi generational gatherings to solo traditions or small chosen family events. Travel spikes among single women seeking distraction through destination experiences, while men more often use the time for personal projects, quiet retreats, or visits to parents without the added complexity of spouse or children logistics. Gift giving economies contract. Fewer people exchange physical presents, favoring digital cards or charitable donations instead. The cultural emphasis on making memories intensifies for those without built in family photo albums, leading to pressure to document solo adventures meticulously. The absence of inherited rituals leaves room for invention, yet invention requires energy that many already spend elsewhere. Over time, the holidays become less about renewal and more about endurance, a seasonal reminder of who shares your table and who does not. Grief and loss take on different textures in this landscape. When a parent passes, the burden of estate settlement, memorial planning, and emotional processing falls heavier on the surviving adult child without siblings or a partner to divide tasks. Women who remained single often shoulder primary caregiving for aging parents earlier and longer, sacrificing career momentum or relocation opportunities. Men who distanced geographically sometimes face criticism for perceived absence, yet maintain firmer boundaries that preserve their own mental bandwidth. Funeral attendance patterns show fewer large extended family turnouts and more intimate services reflecting smaller kinship networks. The cultural script around mourning, leaning on community, receiving casseroles, hearing shared stories, operates at reduced volume when the web of relations has thinned. The cumulative effect across these microdomains creates a kind of parallel existence where the same 24 hours feel profoundly different depending on which path was chosen. One side builds layers of self reliance that harden into genuine capability. The other accumulates adaptations that preserve functionality but rarely transcend it. Neither path is inherently superior in every metric. Solitude offers clarity and control, interdependence offers warmth and legacy, but the asymmetry in long term outcomes grows harder to ignore with each passing year. Biology enforces deadlines that economics and culture can delay but not repeal. Incentive structures reward short term optimization while deferring costs to later decades. The people living these realities adjust minute by minute, day by day, creating lives that are coherent within their own logic, even as the broader system strains under the weight of collective choices. Women who reach midlife with clarity sometimes initiate radical reorientations. They downsize aggressively to unlock capital for relocation, join mixed age communities that blend mentorship with mutual support, or pursue partnerships with men who have maintained traditional values without rigid gender scripts. When these transitions succeed, they often describe a return to vitality that professional success alone never delivered. Deeper rest, richer meals, purposeful movement, intellectual curiosity untethered from performance metrics. The shift requires humility, the willingness to admit that earlier priorities were miscalibrated, and the courage to rebuild under new terms. Success rates vary, but the cases that work demonstrate that course correction remains possible even after significant delay. Men who have settled into autonomous stability rarely express regret over the path taken. They observe the societal conversation from a distance, occasionally offering pragmatic commentary when asked, but invest primary energy in their own systems. Their lives achieve a form of quiet abundance, time freedom, financial optionality, physical capability, and mental clarity that feel luxurious compared to the exhaustion they witnessed in peers who remained in high demand, relational and professional configurations. The absence of certain experiences, parenting milestones, spousal companionship, registers as trade offs consciously accepted rather than losses mourned. This steady divergence may represent the equilibrium state until demographic mathematics force a reckoning. When retiree cohorts balloon and working age populations contract, pressure will build to reimagine everything from social security formulas to urban design standards to educational curricula. Whether that reckoning restores equilibrium between individual sovereignty and collective continuity or accelerates fragmentation depends on the willingness of institutions to name realities plainly and adjust incentives accordingly. The data already exists. The lived experience accumulates daily. The question is no longer whether consequences will arrive, but how societies choose to meet them when they do. The patterns we have mapped across institutions, daily habits, and economic incentives now converge on one central truth that rarely gets stated plainly in public discourse. Modern society has engineered a system that systematically rewards short term individual maximization while penalizing the long term formation of stable, multi generational units capable of sustaining themselves without constant external subsidy. This engineering was never the result of a single coordinated plot. It emerged from the alignment of multiple powerful forces, corporate profit motives that favor mobile, unencumbered workers, policy frameworks built around dual income assumptions, cultural narratives that elevated personal autonomy above almost every other value, and technological tools that made solitary living not just feasible, but frictionless. The outcome is a civilization that has quietly optimized for the preferences and productivity of unattached adults in their prime working years while deferring, and in many cases externalizing, the costs of reproduction, child rearing, elder care, and social cohesion to future cohorts or shrinking state budgets. One of the clearest manifestations of this optimization appears in the way capital allocation has shifted over the past 2 decades. Venture funding, private equity, and even mainstream index investing increasingly flow toward companies that serve or exploit the solo economy. Prop tech startups building micro unit apartment complexes, meal delivery platforms specializing in single portion gourmet telehealth services targeting chronic stress without family involvement, pet care subscription models that substitute for children, and content platforms that monetize loneliness through parasocial relationships all receive billions in capital because they capture recurring revenue from a growing demographic that spends disproportionately on self soothing and convenience. These businesses scale beautifully because their unit economics improve with customer isolation. No need to accommodate varying household sizes, no seasonal dips from family vacations, no complaints about portion sizes or kid friendly options. The financial markets reward this scalability with premium valuations, which in turn pulls more capital away from sectors that historically supported family formation. Affordable suburban housing developers, family oriented retail chains, large vehicle manufacturers, and community infrastructure projects. The money follows the customer behavior, and the customer behavior follows the incentives, creating a self reinforcing loop that makes family centric living feel increasingly like a luxury good rather than a baseline expectation. This capital misallocation shows up starkly in productivity statistics that look healthy on the surface but mask underlying fragility. Aggregate GDP per capita continues to climb in most developed nations, driven by technological efficiency gains and the concentration of high value work in fewer hands. Yet, when adjusted for household formation rates and dependency ratios, the picture darkens. Fewer workers support more non workers over longer periods, and the workers themselves cluster in narrow age bands with less redundancy. The productivity miracle of the past 15 years owes much to automation displacing routine roles, while the remaining human labor concentrates in elite cognitive and creative functions that cannot yet be fully replicated. Women hold a disproportionate share of the displaced roles and a smaller share of the irreplaceable elite ones, meaning the economic shock lands asymmetrically. Men who anticipated the shift and pivoted early into trades, digital entrepreneurship, or asset ownership capture more of the upside, while women who followed the prescribed path of continuous credentialing and corporate loyalty absorb more of the downside when the latter breaks. The asymmetry extends into political behavior and voting patterns, though analysts rarely connect it directly to the underlying demographic reality. Single women without children consistently lean toward parties and candidates promising expanded social safety nets, subsidized childcare, student debt relief, and workplace protections that assume lifelong participation in formal employment. Single men without children more often gravitate toward platforms emphasizing lower taxes, deregulation, personal responsibility, and skepticism of centralized provision. The divide is not purely ideological, it reflects lived incentives. Women who bet on career continuity and delayed family formation need the state to backstop the risks they took. Healthcare costs in midlife, retirement shortfalls without spousal pensions, housing affordability without dual incomes. Men who opted for self reliance and minimalism need the state to intrude less so they can keep more of what they earn and avoid subsidizing systems they do not use. These preferences harden over time as each group watches the other's choices produce visibly different outcomes. Immigration policy enters this equation as both partial mitigation and additional complication. Developed nations facing acute fertility shortfalls have relied on net inflows to stabilize working age populations and tax bases. In many cases, the immigrants arrive from cultures where family formation remains a stronger default, leading to higher birth rates in first generation households. Over one or two generations, however, assimilation pressures and exposure to host country incentives erode that advantage. Children of immigrants adopt lower fertility norms, delay marriage longer, and prioritize education and career paths that mirror native patterns. The demographic relief proves temporary, unless immigration continues at accelerating rates, which introduces its own tensions around cultural cohesion, housing strain, and public service capacity. Native born populations sometimes respond by either emulating the higher fertility subgroups around them or retreating further into individualism as a defensive posture against perceived competition for resources. The net effect is a patchwork demographic landscape, pockets of relative vitality amid broader contraction, rather than uniform renewal. Corporate culture reflects these tensions internally through evolving norms around flexibility, loyalty, and performance. Companies that once offered lifetime employment and generous benefits now operate on project based at will models where the employee is expected to be perpetually adaptable and replaceable. This precarity hits hardest those who cannot easily relocate or upskill, often women anchored to urban job markets or caregiving responsibilities for parents. Performance reviews emphasize quantifiable output over relational contributions, rewarding those who can work irregular hours without domestic friction. Men who have already detached from traditional employment expectations navigate this environment with less emotional investment. They treat jobs as revenue streams rather than identity sources, switching freely when better terms appear. The result is higher voluntary turnover among men who see no long term upside in loyalty, and higher involuntary stagnation among women who invested identity capital in the corporate ladder only to find it retracting. The arts and entertainment industries, always sensitive barometers of cultural mood, have begun to mirror this split in tone and subject matter. Mainstream cinema and television increasingly produce stories of solitary triumph or ambiguous solitude, female protagonists who achieve professional peaks but end films gazing thoughtfully into the distance rather than embracing family resolutions. Male led content skews toward survival narratives, lone wolf competence fantasies, or satirical takes on modern dating that frame commitment as high risk folly. Streaming algorithms amplify the separation by serving each audience what it already prefers, reducing accidental exposure to opposing viewpoints. Independent creators fill niche gaps. Podcasts dissecting the incentives behind male withdrawal, essays from women who pivoted mid career toward family, documentaries tracing the downstream effects of fertility collapse. But these voices rarely cross into mass awareness. The cultural conversation fragments into parallel monologues, each convinced of its own moral clarity, while dismissing the other as misguided or selfish. Public health campaigns struggle to address the fallout without touching the third rail of personal choice. Campaigns around mental health, loneliness, and preventive screening increase in frequency, yet they frame the issues as individual problems to be solved through therapy, medication, community apps, or pet ownership rather than structural incentives that discourage family formation. Fertility awareness initiatives urge earlier planning, but stop short of critiquing the career first messaging that dominates education and media. Obesity and metabolic disease prevention efforts target processed food and sedentary behavior while rarely mentioning how solo living correlates with poorer dietary habits and less consistent exercise accountability. The public health apparatus remains tethered to the premise that individual behavior change can overcome systemic headwinds, even as the data shows correlation after correlation between relational status and health outcomes that persist after controlling for income and education. The financial services industry has quietly built entire product lines around us who thought the solo reality. Robo advisors optimize portfolios for single taxpayers with no dependents, emphasizing tax loss harvesting and Roth conversions over legacy planning. Estate attorneys see rising demand for revocable trusts and charitable remainder arrangements among childless adults who lack obvious heirs. Life insurance sales pivot toward final expense policies that cover funeral costs without assuming spousal survivors. Reverse mortgages gain traction among aging single homeowners who need liquidity but have no children to inherit the property. These products solve real problems for real people, yet their proliferation normalizes the absence of intergenerational transfer as the default rather than the exception. Wealth that once flowed downward through families now stays within the individual's control until it dissipates at death or gets redirected to institutions. This normalization extends to language itself. Terms like chosen family, self partnered, solo poly, and child free by choice have moved from fringe to mainstream, each framing detachment as empowerment rather than trade off. The linguistic shift matters because it shapes how people evaluate their own lives. When solitude is rebranded as self love and family as optional accessory, the perceived cost of foregoing partnership and parenthood drops dramatically. Younger cohorts inherit this vocabulary and apply it reflexively, delaying decisions until the biological window closes or the economic window narrows. The words precede the reality, making the reality feel inevitable once it arrives. Women who reject this framing and pursue partnership anyway often do so against considerable social friction. They face subtle mockery from peers who view early commitment as fear driven or unambitious. They navigate dating markets where many men have already internalized low investment defaults. They contend with workplaces that quietly penalize visible family orientation through reduced assignments or slower promotions. Yet those who persist and succeed frequently describe a sense of alignment that no previous achievement matched, shared goals with a partner, daily purpose derived from children, resilience built through mutual reliance. Their stories circulate in quiet networks rather than viral posts, but they influence siblings, friends, and younger colleagues who witness the contrast between curated independence and lived interdependence. Men who have committed to autonomy continue to refine it with almost architectural precision. They track biomarkers through regular blood work, optimize sleep environments with temperature control and sound masking, curate minimalist wardrobes that eliminate decision fatigue, and maintain emergency funds covering 3 to 5 years of lean expenses. Their lives achieve a form of engineered calm, predictable, controllable, low drama that stands in sharp contrast to the volatility many observed in the relationships around them. The absence of certain traditional milestones registers as deliberate choice rather than deprivation. The long arc suggests that this divergence will persist until the costs become politically or economically intolerable. When pension systems teeter, healthcare wait times lengthen, military recruitment falls short, or innovation stalls from shrinking talent pipelines, pressure will mount for fundamental realignment. Whether that realignment restores balance or doubles down on technological substitutes for human connection remains an open question. What is no longer open is the evidence the girl boss experiment has run its course, the results are in, and the men who walked away are not coming back on the old terms. The final stretch of this reality brings us to the point where speculation meets projection, where the trends we have dissected no longer remain abstract possibilities, but become the default operating system for entire societies unless deliberate, coordinated intervention occurs at scale. By the middle of the century, the demographic mathematics will have locked in outcomes that current policy debates barely acknowledge. The worker to retiree ratio in most Western nations will hover between 1.8 and 2.2 to 1 in many projections, a level that makes current pay as you go pension architectures mathematically insolvent without drastic benefit cuts, massive tax increases, or sustained high immigration that itself introduces new social and economic frictions. Healthcare systems will face chronic staffing shortages as the caregiver generation shrinks while the patient generation swells, pushing reliance toward robotics, remote monitoring, and institutional care models that prioritize efficiency over human warmth. Innovation pipelines will narrow because smaller cohorts of young adults mean fewer outliers, fewer radical thinkers, and fewer people willing to take the personal risks that historically drove breakthroughs in science, technology, and culture. Military recruitment will struggle to meet quotas in nations that once fielded large volunteer forces drawn from stable family backgrounds, forcing either conscription revival or greater dependence on automated and outsourced defense capabilities. These macro outcomes trace directly back to the micro choices made by millions of individuals who followed the cultural script of maximal personal autonomy during their fertile years. The women who reached their 40s and 50s without children or stable partnerships now form the leading edge of this wave, entering elderhood with fewer natural advocates, fewer informal caregivers, and greater dependence on systems already stretched thin. Their stories, once shared in private support groups or anonymous online threads, will become commonplace in mainstream reporting. The accomplished professional who sold her urban condo to afford assisted living because no family remained to help maintain a house. The former executive who relies on scheduled visits from paid aides because friends have scattered or passed. The high achieving academic who funds cryonics research in the faint hope of future revival because legacy ended with her own life. These are not isolated tragedies, but statistical clusters produced by deliberate cultural engineering that treated family as an elective rather than foundational element of human existence. Men who walked away early will enter the same period with different vulnerabilities and strengths. Their financial independence, built through decades of low consumption living and aggressive asset accumulation, provides a buffer against many systemic failures. They own property outright in affordable regions, maintain diversified income streams that do not require daily labor, and cultivate health habits that extend functional years. Yet, even they face the limits of solitude when mobility declines, chronic conditions emerge, or cognitive sharpness fades. Without adult children or close kin, they too will rely on institutional solutions or paid help, though their leaner lifestyles and stronger networks of chosen male friendships often yield better subjective quality of life in those final decades. The contrast remains stark. Women more likely to express retrospective regret over paths not taken. Men more likely to affirm the trade offs as worthwhile given the alternatives they observed. The political response to this convergence will likely fragment along familiar lines. Progressive coalitions will push for universal basic income, expanded public elder care, subsidized fertility treatments, and immigration liberalization as ways to paper over the gaps. Conservative voices will advocate tax incentives for marriage and children, deregulation of housing and energy to make family formation affordable again, and cultural campaigns that reframe parenthood as civic duty rather than personal lifestyle choice. Neither side has yet demonstrated the stomach for the structural reforms required, overhauling education to teach trade offs explicitly from adolescence, redesigning workplaces to reward family time without career penalties, or rewriting family law to eliminate perverse incentives that discourage male commitment. Incremental measures will continue. Baby bonuses that barely move the needle, paternity leave expansions that see low uptake among men who never planned families, housing vouchers that cannot keep pace with zoning induced scarcity. The result will be a patchwork of partial fixes that slow but do not reverse the trajectory. Technological substitutes will fill some voids but create others. Artificial companions, conversational AI tuned for emotional support, robotic aids for physical tasks, virtual reality environments that simulate family gatherings will gain traction among aging singles who prefer simulated connection to none at all. These tools promise to reduce loneliness metrics without requiring the mutual vulnerability of real relationships, right? Yet early adopters already report a hollowing effect. The AI never disappoints, but never truly knows you. The robot cleans efficiently, but never shares history. The VR family reunion feels vivid until the headset comes off and silence returns. The technology addresses symptoms while deepening the underlying detachment, potentially accelerating the very isolation it claims to solve. Cultural production will continue to reflect this tension. Future generations of creators, raised in smaller cohorts with fewer siblings and cousins, will produce art that wrestles with absence as a central theme. Novels about ghost families, films depicting parallel lives that never intersected, music that mourns what was never built. Some works will romanticize the autonomous path, portraying solitude as heroic clarity in a chaotic world. Others will critique it as quiet tragedy, showing characters who achieved everything society promised, only to discover the promises were incomplete. The audience will split along generational and experiential lines, with older cohorts more receptive to reevaluation narratives and younger ones more likely to double down on individualism because it remains the only model they have known. Education systems, facing shrinking enrollment, will consolidate campuses, merge programs, and shift toward online delivery that further reduces the incidental human contact once provided by dorm life, group projects, and campus events. Curricula may begin incorporating explicit modules on life planning, fertility windows, partnership economics, the compounding value of early interdependence, but only after the demographic damage has already compounded for decades. Vocational tracks will expand as society recognizes that not every path requires a 4 year degree. Yet the prestige hierarchy will persist, channeling ambitious students toward credentials that deliver diminishing returns in an automated economy. The women who sound the loudest alarms today will become historical footnotes in tomorrow's textbooks, remembered as the generation that lived the experiment at its most intense phase and paid the steepest personal price. Their warnings, once dismissed as anecdotal or regressive, will gain retrospective weight as data accumulates on happiness disparities, health gradients, and economic fragility among childless cohorts. Historians will debate whether the girl boss era represented genuine progress derailed by unforeseen side effects or a well intentioned miscalculation that ignored human nature's stubborn refusal to conform to ideological blueprints. Either way, the verdict will be clear. The path of hyper independence scaled poorly when scaled to an entire demographic. Men who chose walking away will appear in those same accounts as pragmatic adapters rather than villains or victims. Their decision to redirect energy towards self mastery, financial sovereignty, and voluntary simplicity will be seen as a logical response to a cultural environment that devalued their traditional contributions until the moment provision became convenient again. Future analysts may credit them with pioneering new models of male flourishing that emphasize internal locus of control, low time preference, and resistance to exploitative relational dynamics. Their lives, stripped of certain conventional markers, will be studied as examples of how meaning can be constructed without reliance on external validation or biological legacy. The final question societies will face is whether they can engineer a soft landing, gradual cultural rebalancing that restores equilibrium without authoritarian measures or economic collapse, or whether the landing will be hard, marked by abrupt policy reversals, generational resentment, and institutional breakdowns. The soft path requires honesty at every level, admitting that biology imposes non negotiable deadlines, that interdependence delivers forms of fulfillment independence cannot replicate, that children represent both cost and investment in civilizational continuity. It demands workplaces that stop punishing family time, housing markets that stop pricing young adults out of family formation, and media that stop glorifying solo success while ignoring its long tail. The hard path arrives if those admissions never come, if institutions continue optimizing for the preferences of unattached prime age adults until the system buckles under its own contradictions. Either way, the era of pretending trade offs do not exist has ended. The data is in. The lived experience is undeniable. The projections are converging. Women who followed the script now face the consequences alone. Men who rejected it built lives of genuine peace on their own terms. The asymmetry is permanent unless the underlying incentives change fundamentally. Until then, each individual continues navigating the world that was handed to them, making the best choices possible within constraints that no single person created, but everyone now inherits. To the 1 hour gang who made it through the entire arc from start to finish, absolute respect for your dedication because covering 21,000 words of unfiltered analysis takes real commitment and you stayed locked in the whole way. If these breakdowns have sharpened your perspective on where things stand and where they are headed, and you want to keep supporting this level of direct, no compromise content, show it by grabbing me a Red Bull through the link in the description. It keeps the engine running and the truth coming without dilution. Drop your final thoughts in the comments below. What stood out most across the whole series? The economic math, the health gradients, the cultural reframing, the technological substitutes, or the simple human asymmetry at the core of it all? Do you see any realistic path to reversal in your lifetime, or are we locked into this divergence for generations? Be honest, be detailed. Your perspective closes the loop on this conversation. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.